Welcome to the Campaign Strategist. We're trying out a new thing of doing quick interviews on topical news. And so I've asked Justin Kwasa, who is the Democracy Program Director at the League of Conservation Voters, to talk to us about the recent Supreme Court decision on the Voting Rights Act. So, Justin, let's just start by what was the decision? Why does it matter?
Yeah, with the Keller division, ultimately, first off, it's important to understand that this is part of a 16-year slow degradation of the Voting Rights Act that's happened in the Supreme Court. That all started with the Shelby v. Holder decision in 2010. So ultimately, different sections of the Voting Rights Act has been stripped away to the point now where, in order to prove that, a voting act is, racist, you have to prove intent instead of impact, which basically means somebody has to just directly say, I want to take away the votes of Black people. And then all of a sudden it'll be considered, unconstitutional, rather than looking at whatever the reasonable impacts of those decisions are. So that's where we've gotten to. And so ultimately, while the Voting Rights Act of 1965 still stands, it's basically unenforceable, or at least it will not be able to be enforced by the civil rights groups and other people who have done it. And so what we've seen in the meantime, literally within days of this decision being made, we saw southern states go directly after previously protected maps that have majority minority districts, which are districts where the majority of the people in those districts are from some type of minority group, in this case, Black communities. And they've gone directly after those, trying to dissolve those House seats in order to once again get another advantage in these upcoming midterms and beyond, in terms of what the representation is in the federal legislature.
And one of the key nuances in how the Supreme Court has decided to interpret the Voting Rights Act is they're being willfully blind to the actual impact of this sort of distinction about, oh, it's okay to gerrymander for partisan purposes if you want to lock Democrats out of power, while pretending that that doesn't mean it gives a green light to lock Black voters out of power if the purpose is to reduce Democratic representation in Congress. So it absolutely has the impact of disenfranchising Black voters of their ability to choose who they want to represent them in Congress.
Absolutely. And I think what's also, I'll take it a step further. It seems like the Supreme Court decision was also just coordinated with a lot of these Republican leaders, because of just the extreme speed with which these maps are generated. You have to remember that these maps aren't generated overnight. These are meticulously drawn. They're meticulously looked after in order to make sure that certain areas are or are not included. And so the fact that these states were able to produce these maps so quickly reeks that there was some type of collusion, and ultimately shows that, at least for, a particular side, their main goal in order to maintain power is to particularly attack communities of color, specifically in this case, Black communities.
So what are the implications for this year's midterms and for congressional representation after this year's elections, just going forward?
Absolutely. So I think, as we've already seen, like up to a dozen seats can be flipped over from traditionally Democrat to Republican. Yes, at least a dozen seats. Obviously, additional map drawing can happen. But we've already seen plenty of redistricting even before the decision in Texas and North Carolina, and obviously in the southern states for that. But ultimately, these mid-decade redistricting processes will continue to happen. So we already know that Georgia will attempt to open up a special session next month in order to draw maps that aren't going to affect this election, but will affect the 2028 presidential election. South Carolina might also be doing the same. And ultimately, any state, both the Republican or Democrat, has the ability to redraw maps anytime between now and the 2028 election, and obviously before the 2030 census and 2031 redistricting process. So I think that's what we're looking at. And ultimately, we already know the margin in the House is extremely small. Yeah. So this gives way more space for Republican legislatures, at least in Washington, D.C., to continue to push forward the Trump agenda. But also what's not being focused on, and what's also as scary and can be as detrimental, is the fact that this isn't only about what happens federally. This also can affect how state legislatures are drawn too. And so A lot of times there are Democratic states that rely, oh, sorry, sometimes Democratic states try to fill in the missing protections that that the federal legislature hasn't done. And so we will see redistricting happening on the state levels in order to create super majorities there potentially for Republican allies. And this also even goes down to local legislatures. This goes to water boards, other public service utilities, depending on how those elections happen in states. So right now we're just seeing what the impact is federally, but this will trickle down the further along we go into the state as well as local elections and legislatures.
I imagine it's not just because of the redistricting at those lower electoral levels, but also the impact on voters themselves who may feel as a result of this, what's the point? Because there's no way I'm going to get the person in Congress I want, which then means all those down ballot races will not be voted on by those folks. So there seems like there's several ways in which this, unless something happens to change this is really setting up a very long-term shift in the fundamental power dynamics in the country, and which makes it much easier for the Republicans to achieve what I've thought of as a long-time dream, to just be able to lock Democrats out of power so they can have their way with us.
So I work for an environmental organization, and so this will affect environmental policy. This will affect healthcare. This will affect education. Well, I think everything that we think of in terms of progressive organization that we want to see, it'll make it harder to pass, not only federally, but also state and local.
So what's the answer? What can people do about this?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the answer what it always is always be more active, more public education, but more public, or sorry, I should say civic engagement. So right now, what we're looking at in all the states that kind of are in the middle of a redistricting process, there are in-person events, there are rallies at the Capitol, there are committee hearing meetings that we need public testimony on. So identifying in your state if the redistricting process is going on, where can you hop in and make sure to show up in person in order to reach out to legislatures or call your legislatures. This will be happening. This will be happening right now in states, but also as we flip this calendar and go into the 2027 state legislative sessions, continuing up that momentum and making sure to advocate for fair maps, for fair maps if those processes come on. But also looking at the 2026 election, the only way we can do it is just out organize and out mobilize. And so really making sure we have a clear educational campaigns telling people how to vote and also when to vote. So we really want to make sure that people understand that you need to vote, but also that there are people out there that are trying to subvert and sabotage and suppress your vote. And so make sure that people understand it is important to vote early, be an October voter. If you are returning your ballots, making sure to ideally drop them off at ballot boxes rather than mail them back, since there's the whole Supreme Court case that's going to come up currently around postmarks for your ballot. So telling people to have a plan, make sure to vote early. But then we're also telling people to go beyond that. Voting is just the first step, but we also want people to be directly involved in the administration of elections. And that can happen in two ways. First off, if you can be a poll worker, working inside polling places on the day of elections, we're really encouraging people to do that. So Power the Polls runs a great campaign every single year in order to recruit new poll workers all across the country. And so if you have the time, the ability to be a poll worker in your local precinct, that is what we're asking for, making sure that everybody has their voice heard no matter what challenges come up. But if you can't do that, also there's work to be done outside the poll, being a poll watcher. And so they're the ones that are monitoring what's happening, reporting those up to, a larger infrastructure, and basically being outside the polling place, reporting and answering people's questions about what's happening, about how to make sure their voice is heard. And so that includes, working with the 866R vote hotline, answering people's questions around what's going on. And so that's the final thing. That's another thing that you can do. The final thing, which is kind of connected to the poll watchers, is ultimately we have the belief that in certain jurisdictions, there might be the attempt to discount votes that have already been cast. And so there's the need for post-election vote counters to ensure that every single vote is counted, to ensure that we have clean elections, and ultimately making sure that in December and late November, when these elections are certified, they are certified clean without anybody being taken away. So ultimately, all of that can be done through the Election Protection Coalition, 866R Vote.
Say that number again.
866 our votes.
Got it. Okay.
Is the number that you can call in order to have any question answered about your about voting. But then also going to that website, 866ourvote.org, you can sign up to be poll monitors
Okay.
all across the country and in your local jurisdiction.
Great.
So not only do we want you to vote, but we also want you to physically be active in the administration of election, or at least reporting on what's happening in your local neighborhoods to ensure we have clean elections.
So we're on a tilted playing field, or even more tilted, but it's not insurmountable if we organize like hell and get out there and make sure we protect the integrity of the vote. Good, good. And is there a central like place where people can find out local events happening near them to push back on this and organize around it?
Yeah. So in the short term, one of the great places to do, particularly for if you live in the South, is allroadsleadstothe.south.org.
Okay.
They are a coalition of Southern voting rights groups that are working together to do a number of events and mobilization in each of the counties as it comes up. If you heard of the Voting Rights Day of Action that happened this past Saturday, also family, they were the ones behind that. And so as things pop up, they're the right ones to be going to for additional information. And then other groups like Indivisible, like Move On, will have kind of what the local events or mobilization in your area will also be great to go to.
All right. Well, I'll put those links up on the screen and in the description. Justin, thanks so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this quick chat, and I'll let you go. Get back to your conference or retreat. Oh, I can't hear you again.